Hi, Robin.
Hello, Agnes. What should we talk about?
So, I would like to talk to you about a topic, a problem of which I think you have less firsthand experience than anyone I know. So
Oh,
you should have an interesting perspective on it.
okay. That
Um,
means I know almost nothing about how to solve it.
Correct. You know nothing from firsthand experience.
Right.
Okay. The problem is the tension between the goals of intellectual activity and the goals of social activity. So let me sketch this for you. The place where this becomes really obvious to me is when I go give a talk somewhere. I gave the talk, there's a Q&A and there's a kind of, lively, engaged discussion of what I've just said. And then after that, there's like a dinner or a lunch or something where really only the most sophisticated and experienced and, um, uh, you know, the people in the room who are really dedicated to philosophy, those people are the ones who come to the meal afterwards, right? But at the meal, where you might think what would happen is like an intense philosophical discussion. That's not what happens. What happens is socializing of one form or another. And I actually made this prediction the last talk that I gave in the Q&A. I said, after this talk, there's going to be a dinner, and then we're not going to talk philosophy at the dinner. And I thought maybe if I say that, then people, to be contrarian, will try to do the opposite, and then we would do it, but
Yeah.
it didn't work. So this is the general problem. It's weird to me that people who devote their lives to intellectual inquiry and who, in some cases are rarely around other people who are interested in it and have an unusual opportunity to talk about it, are only taking that opportunity in the structured environment of the Q&A and not in the in more free form environment of the dinner. Okay, what are your first thoughts?
Well, so you know, first of all, there's just a job and non-job stuff, right? So, I mean, we very much frame our time allocation as job versus non-job, just in general, not just in philosophy or academia. And people like to draw a relatively sharp distinction there. And even if they like their job, they also like to have non-job time. And they're often somewhat jealous or hesitant to allow too much job stuff to slip over into non-job stuff. They want to draw a line and hold it there as some sort of protest or defense against the rapacious capitalists or whoever are trying to exploit them into working too much. So I think we just have a general norm in our society about drawing a line between job and non-job time, and also a norm that we should have a substantial amount of non-job time, even with people who share the same job. So that seems sufficient to explain what you just described if it were an ordinary job. That is, for a typical or pretty standard job, there's job time, and then people are working together on the job. And then once you call it non-job time, then people are usually relatively reluctant to get too much into job things, although they'll sometimes do gossiping about job people. But that's a little different than jobbing, right? So it seems to me the main issue here is if you think of this as not a usual job, as a holy crusade, as a way of life, as a passion, the sort of thing you might want to fill lots of your life up with, even if you weren't paid for it, then what you're describing becomes a little more puzzling. So the first question is, how many of these people see this as more than just a job?
Well, so let me raise two things. So one of them is I just want to pull up a norm to counter your norm. It's a totally different topic, but this is one you could have invoked to explain the opposite phenomenon, which is intellectuals in general have a bit of a self-conception as having a calling as intellectuals and putting themselves forward as intellectuals. Like they want to seem intellectual. They want to seem to others like they're passionate about ideas and interested in ideas. And you might want to think they would want to play that at off times too, to come across as being intellectual. So that's a contrary norm that you might have thought would have led to the opposite behavior. Um, one thing about these dinners is, I mean, you don't have to go, right? So, like, you could go to dinner with your family instead. You could go to dinner with your friends. You're choosing to go to dinner with this group of people. And it seems like it's just an odd choice for who to go to dinner with if you want time off from philosophy.
Well, let's see. I think for a lot of people whose job isn't intellectuals, they actually do spend a substantial part of their free social time trying to brand themselves as intellectuals. That is, it's quite common for people who would be a dentist or some other sorts of professional to, at a dinner party, play the intellectual and discuss intellectual topics, quote intellectuals. That's actually a pretty common thing for people whose job is not being an intellectual. So you might then think, well, once your job is intellectual, you've got the stamp of approval. You no longer need to prove that you're an intellectual. And so you don't necessarily need to fill your extra social time with such things in the same way that somebody else who is trying to assert themselves as an intellectual, whose job isn't that way and might be trying to do.
Okay, I mean, so if the thing were really about branding yourself that way, and fair enough, I was the one who made that point. So, but I guess I just think, in the most naive way, it seems like a missed opportunity. It's like if a bunch of artists who were really into doing collaborative art got together, but they didn't do collaborative art or something.
So I have actually a relevant piece of data. I once read this book, and I wrote a review on it. And I believe it was about prestige, but the name of the book wasn't Prestige. It was something about, it was basically about people who get hired for very prestigious jobs in law and management consulting, and some sort of other management thing I'm trying to remember. But the key idea was it was a book about how exactly these prestige market worked. Pedigree was the name of the book. I found my post on it. How elite students get elite jobs. And it went into quite some detail about how these elite job places chose and hired their elite students. And these places very much wanted to have students who matched the job on the kind of degree they got. But it was also very important to ask them about their hobbies and other behaviors. I think law schools maybe was one of these, but anyway, elite behaviors. And it was very much a bad sign if somebody's hobbies overlapped too much with their professional aspirations. That was considered about. So, for example, a business student who did business as their major, if they, on their free time, were involved in starting a business, perhaps, or even just like a business club, and they just really wanted to talk about business, that was considered a bad sign. That was just not okay. There was this sense that you weren't a well-rounded person. You were more of a pretender, or there's a sense in which like you're trying to.
It seems like you're the opposite of a pretender. You're very committed.
Well, but what they wanted is elites, not people good at their jobs. Fundamentally, they were selecting for elites. They wanted to get people from an elite culture who acted the way. And in our culture, elites don't do that. That's not. Actually, the phrase I have here is excess interest in some particular set of ideas marks you as a boring tool. Boring because you aren't able to talk about lots of other things that everybody else wants to talk about, and a tool because you don't have your own agenda. You're just a slave to this profession or topic area of yours. I'm not. There is a widespread norm like this.
Okay, so maybe the thought is that being well-rounded, having interests outside of your job, and having specifically elite interests, that those are going to mark you as some kind of like a leader, And also mark you as a social success, someone who's good at social contexts and is a potential leadership material. Is that the idea?
I think, they're just going for a kind of person who's like us, basically. There's just a kind of person who's in these roles, and they're trying to pick other people like them.
If these people happen to not be elites, but like nerds or whatever, then they would be like selecting for that just because they want people who are similar to them. So it's nothing to do with elites per se. It's just people like others to be similar to themselves.
And in these communities, they're part of a whole network of people who are all trying to pick out that same group of elites together. So, that would, if you and I played racquetball and we wanted to hire someone who played racquetball to be in our thing, we wouldn't expect to be part of a large world of people who all like racquetball, right? So this is a much larger world where not only what people like themselves, but they expect that will go well for their organization. That is, it'll help them place people in their organization to others, and they will gain respect and those sorts of things.
Good. And I mean, I guess that does go back to me to like socializing. That is, and obviously the demands on success in socializing are going to be relative to a community, right? And so relative to to this community, if you have, these narrow interests in just the business stuff, you will be poor at socializing and you'll fail at your job because part of your job involves this socializing that's just built into it, right? That's the idea.
Well, I think you'd be well associated with these sorts of people. Mm-hmm. Which is different.
And that's the way it is. I mean, the job includes these sorts of people, right? So that's just
could include other people. So
it could. We could live in a different world, but this is the world they're hiring you into.
So here's two related points. One, just an anecdote. I won't name a name, but I have a colleague who, is an economist, and told me that that won't reveal very much, went on interviews at places about, visiting places to talk to people, and they were considering him for jobs. And he heard back from the grapevine that they just didn't like the fact that as soon as he, met somebody off the plane, he started talking ideas. That was just his thing. And that bugged other people. They just didn't like that. That was just too much. He was not following the proper script to talk about other things. Another point is this idea of whether nerds are bad at socializing. So I've been part of relatively nerdy work groups like software engineers and other kinds of engineers.
Right.
And often they put somebody who's not such an engineer in charge of them under the story that this person is better at doing social stuff, even if they don't know the tech stuff. Mm-hmm. And, the claim is, I suppose, something like they read people better or they connect to people better or something like that. But they often don't connect very well to the nerds under them. And the nerds under them are perfectly fine at connecting to each other. They just don't connect to the management class, which is the sort of people this manager is supposed to connect to. And, there's a basic question of, some people say the nerds are bad at socializing, so they are poorly able to coordinate. But it seems to me they are actually able to coordinate with each other. The nerds are perfectly capable of forming work groups and compromising and working out their, the relative roles and making sure they do them. They can do all that social stuff with each other. The problem they have is with other sorts of people who don't share their similar sorts of interests.
I'll just say that's not my experience of nerds. That is, perhaps they are good at coordinating when there's a task and they specifically only have to coordinate on that task and they know they don't need their lives to be in contact in any other way. But if I'm just thinking about the nerds I know and their social environments, they often involve a lot of non-nerds, but buffering, and that it doesn't seem true to me that like two people who kind of have very specific modes of socializing that they're kind of set in. If you try to make those two people get along, they're not like especially likely to get along.
Well, so if we go back to the academic nerds, my friend who I was describing is an academic nerd because he wants to talk ideas as soon as he gets to the plane. And in some sense, you are an academic nerd to the extent you're trying to get these dinner groups to talk about ideas, right?
Yeah.
They're trying to do the general social thing and you're trying to talk about more specific ideas. So you and my friend are these nerds. So now the question becomes, for the purpose of advancing the general intellectual project, are we most effective talking about ideas whenever we can, or is there some other effectiveness and use for the intellectual project, not just our personal lives, of doing all this other sort of socializing?
Right. And I'm not, my question is just about the tension between these two things, not like which one should win or something. At least it's just striking to me to notice that the tension exists even among the most intellectual people. And by the way, you're classifying me as a nerd. I'm not sure I identify as a nerd. I think I experience this phenomenon as a problem. That is, I dislike it and it makes me dislike a lot of dinners. But I don't quite have the ability to just do the other thing. That is, I am pulled by these forces, these social forces, where I feel like, okay, now we need to change the topic because the topic needs to wander quite a lot if we're having a social conversation. I experience those forces and I yield to them. And I think that that's why people like me and they find me easy to get along with. And probably those same hiring committees that didn't want to hire that guy would want to hire me because I would understand what they wanted and I would do it. So I guess maybe I'm more of an in-between kind of Kate. That's why I said I think you have no personal experience of this, because I think you just do not experience the social forces at all. You're just like, but even you, like if you met, like right now we're doing a podcast. And so here's a good way to think about it. Like right now we're under a little bit of pressure. For instance, we're under pressure to stay on topic, right? We have a topic, the social versus the intellectual. And we're supposed to discuss that topic. And we're not supposed to veer off into personal anecdotes, which, as you know me, I do quite a lot of when I'm not constrained by the norms of the podcast, right? We need to sort of try to make progress on this question. And we're under the stress of having to do that by the artificial environment that we've created, the podcast. And I feel like that's a lot like the Q&A after a talk. And that what happens in the dinner is like all of those pressures are sort of released, and that maybe like the intellectual goals that we have, maybe they just need for many of us just quite a lot of structure in order for us to be able to pursue them, because they're like stressful and they create a psychological tension. And I was raising this issue with somebody over lunch today, this exact problem. And he was saying, well, look, imagine if at this lunch, which was a lunch after a talk where exactly this thing happened. He's like, imagine, when I asked the speaker a question after his talk, he gave me an answer and then I pushed back a little, but then, it had to end. It was a Q&A. It was the next person's turn to talk. But imagine at a lunch, if I just won't let it go and we just get more and more heated and we just get angrier and angrier at each other. And now we've got to have to sit here for the next hour and have lunch or dinner, right? So it's also the case, not only do these frameworks provide, stresses, but they also provide, in some sense, a certain kinds of security. Like we each know we won't have to talk about this for more than an hour, right? And at an hour, we'll be cut off. And that's like a kind of reassurance that we have, right? And so maybe somehow the unconstrained environment of the dinner, it's just like too scary.
Well, I think the dinner is a differently constrained environment. It's not unconstrained, but maybe its different constraints are more conducive to some other kind of behavior. So the largest level, I think we should just say, there's a set of different kinds of behavior you can engage in, and there's a set of different kinds of contexts in which you might engage in these different behavior. And you were just raising the question of the relative matching between the behavior and the context, but that seems more secondary importance to me than the overall mix of the different kinds of behavior and what sort of pressures might push for that different mixes. So that is, we can think of some of the tasks that we might do together in talking as more job-oriented, more technical, more specific to a job on the one hand, right? And then we see other tasks could just be, having fun in a leisure sense that has no other purpose than merely enjoying a social connection with people or something. And we can think in the middle are some kinds of social tasks that are less tied to particular things we're doing on the job together and more about our various social connections in this network of people doing jobs and the various kinds of alliances we have and the kinds of ways that we might need to build or repair or maintain various sorts of social connections in order to continue to do the specific tasks, as well as just to have be a person with a life, right? So in addition, for a job, just as a person, you want to have a network of social connections such that, you can use them for all your other purposes in your life, not just your job purposes. But that's, to me, like the main spectrum of interest here. And then we might ask, in these intermediate tasks where we're doing social things, we're maintaining social connections, we're getting to know people socially in a general sense, we're deciding who likes who and who's with who, reassuring people that we respect them. The hard part is to then ask how much of that is necessary for the technical achievement of the fundamental profession we're in, say, versus that even if it weren't necessary, we'd still be doing it because there's just going to be these social games by which people win or lose. That is, even if you're good at your job, if you're not good at the social game, you might lose out because there's the social game of deciding who's in or out and who gets to do what. And so that sort of could describe, so the social stuff could be productive in helping us do our jobs better, or it could be somewhat parasitic in the sense that any world that allows social things, the social parasites will arise and they will take some of the energy and time in order to, manage their social games. Or as, a way in which the outside world is parasitic. That is because you want friends and lovers and, recommendations for your kids' schools. You want to have a lot of social connections. And so whenever you have the opportunity, you build up social connections in order to help the other things you're trying to do. So that seems to be the hardest thing to think about. For what purposes are these social games useful?
Yeah. So, there's sort of two ways to understand why we're playing the social games instead of engaging the intellectual activity. One is the social games have value, and the other is that the intellectual activity has disvalue, right? And I was putting forward the second thesis, that is that intellectual activity is scary and dangerous, except under certain very regulated circumstances. It's like experimenting with like viruses or whatever. We don't want to just do it willy-nilly. Bad things can happen, right? But you're right that the other side of it is like there's a positive good that we're achieving potentially, and then you're asking how good is it? I will say the following of my experience of philosophy socializing. To me, the following is a shocking fact. If two philosophers, they're meeting for the first time, they're meeting at a conference, talking in the hallway, at a dinner, whatever, and then they walk away from that meeting, I feel like pretty much always, 99% of the time, each person is like, that was a nice guy. Oh, I like her. I want to be friends with her. It's like this incredible success rate, right? Like 100% conversion rate or something where everybody likes everybody else. And you might have thought, well, people are different and some people are mean and some people are annoying and people would walk away with all sorts of very different impressions of each other. But I think we're just like super good at this game. So as soon as we play it with everyone wins, like every time almost. I mean, not every last person, but like the vast majority of people. And so it's almost like, what is even the use of it? Like we can it's a foregone conclusion. I feel like I go give a talk somewhere. It's a foregone conclusion. People are going to like me. They always like me. Everyone always likes everyone else. And yet we still do it. And that's what makes me think it's not so much to create these allegiances that probably don't have much of a function since they're so cheaply created anyway. It maybe is because we're avoiding the other thing.
I mean, I think the people you actually got friends with at these conferences, that's different than people you didn't meet and never talked to, that you are creating a social connection there. That's different from the connections you have with people you never talked to. And I think that's just literally true.
I'm saying they're so easy to create that I am skeptical that they have much value.
Well, easy, but time consuming. That is, each one of these things took a substantial amount of time.
It's not even that substantial. I mean, this might be one meal. It might be one conversation in a hallway.
So let me we're doing personal anecdotes here, even if we're not supposed to.
You're always allowed to do personal anecdotes, because you almost never do them.
So, when I moved to Silicon Valley long ago in 1984, and started socializing with people there, I started socializing with a very nerdy group of people. And this was a revelation to me because I had previously never been around as people sort of as compatible with me as these people were, because they really just loved to talk ideas the whole time. And my wife would come along to say to these parties, and she would find them unpleasant because these people were not putting the effort into being pleasantly social. They were just talking ideas. And in fact, some of them didn't wash very well or didn't wear nice clothes or things like that. And I find it very charming because we were all just focused on ideas and we weren't focused on these other things. But, she noticed the contrast between this sort of ordinary social world that she would expect and be comfortable in, and this social world, which was doing none of the social things and just talking ideas. So, the two things to notice here is, in this world, one of them is lots of people talk to each other. They didn't all like each other. There were lots of pairs of people who would have these intellectual discussions and not like each other. Right. So that's one of the risks of just talking about ideas intensely, as you might come to disagree and not make the smooth social connection. But the other is that it was quite possible for these people to just talk about ideas for a long time. That's perfectly feasible. And they enjoyed it, right? So it seems to me it's less about, for many sorts of people, it's quite feasible and comfortable and enjoyable to talk ideas just for the entire time for a certain sort of nerds, but they will, in fact, less succeed at making everybody their friend.
Right. So in my heart of hearts, I think it's absolutely possible for everyone to talk ideas for a long time and enjoy it. I just think that for different people, there are different social circumstances that are going to facilitate that activity. And it may be, for instance, that like with your group of nerds, the thing that facilitated it was being around other people who were very similar to them, as in terms of being nerds and not caring about whether or not they had showered and things like that. But it's just surprising to me, like you would think that of all the people, the ones for whom it would be easiest, who would most naturally fall into an intellectual conversation when socializing, would be like professional intellectuals who are maybe even working on the same material, like have tons of stuff intellectually in common. And
so let's talk about the difference between the most passionate hobbyists of X and the professionals of X. These are often not that strongly overlapping groups of people.
Right.
So take, I don't know, anything, rocket ships or something, right? Or aliens, say, even. Just take any topic and then look among the ordinary people who are just the most passionate about it, who love the subject the most, who talk about it the most, who are just, most eager to go to events about it, et cetera. Look at that group of people and now compare it to the group of people who are just paid to do that sort of thing. These groups of people overlap to some degree. That there is a correlation that people who are paid to do something are somewhat more passionate about it, but it's not that strong a correlation. Often you'll see the people who are paid to do something, they are not actually that passionate about it, and they don't actually want to spend their free time doing it. They're good and they found a spot in it. And then there are these people who are just really passionate and love to talk about it, who are just, ineffective in various ways. They could make it a career, or maybe they're just not as capable a person in many ways. These are just different kinds of people.
Right. And so maybe if you went back in time, right? But you're the person you are now, but you go back and you have a chance to go to one of those dinner parties or whatever that you used to go to in Silicon Valley. Maybe you would just find the discussion like hopelessly naive. Like you've gone way past this, and I guess perhaps that's perhaps what you're describing as literally amateurs. The word amateur, it means lover. Amateur, it means someone who loves something, right? And so maybe part of it is that the professionals want to be careful and they don't want to make stupid mistakes, and they want to approach their activity in a professional way, holding themselves to certain standards. And the enthusiasts, those are the ones having late night philosophy discussions about the meaning of life that maybe most professional philosophers would look down their noses at as like having no precision and respectability to it. So maybe that's part of it, is that having a fun conversation about something is in tension with the activity of holding the pursuit of that topic to intellectual standards. That'd be depressing, but
I don't think it's quite the holding it to standards, but it is related. So So I've often said, as my summary of the world, right? There's two kinds of people I'm interested in. There's the people who just are really interested in something and interested enough to pursue it and be passionate about it. And then there's the people willing to be careful about something. And then I find the intersection between these two to be sadly very small. And those are the kind of people I'm interested
You're only interested in people who lie at the intersection? So you're only interested in one kind of person?
The intersection of these two classes. So
okay.
There are these two classes and there's an intersection. And I'm primarily interested in this intersection.
Okay.
So even though both classes are large, the intersection is quite small.
Okay.
Surprisingly small. And that's a way I've summarized like who I'm looking for when I'm trying to interact with people. So, and in some sense, I think it is because the kind of show you put on or the kind of persona you become are somewhat in conflict for these two distinctive types of people. So academia around us is full of careful people. People who are methodical, careful, make sure they know things, are reluctant to say more than they know. And I think in substantial part because of that, they're reluctant to show much enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Or energy. They are reluctant to be just really excited about something and overflow with energy about it and really want to be into it. And on the other hand, there are these people who are really enthusiasts. They are excited and energetic, and they want to talk about it a lot, and they want to go people. But I think they are also reluctant to be careful. That is, care seems in that world like a hesitancy, a lack of full devotion to the topic. Whereas in the other world, the enthusiasm looks like sloppiness and bias. And the two kinds of personas are somewhat in conflict. It is somewhat hard to project. I mean, what I try to do, but many don't believe me, I'm trying to project the persona of, I love this stuff, this is great, this is really important, and I'm going to be really careful and methodical and unbiased, and if it looks wrong, I'm going to reject it. I'm going to be quite willing to reject the stuff I'm feeling enthusiastic about if it doesn't meet the standards. But I'm really enthused about the prospect of looking in a space of things for stuff that might meet the standards.
I think that's super helpful, the thing you just said, because it sort of suggests that there's just really a deep chasm that is causing this phenomenon that I'm experiencing of the tension between the intellectual and the social. Like it's partly that the tension between being interested and being careful. And maybe people feel like, say, when they're socializing, the main thing they want to be is interested. And they want to be able to be, so they have to find topics where they don't have to be careful. And those are often going to be things like gossiping. Like that's a big part of what people do, right? Gossiping, right. Who is being hired where, who is misbehaving about what, right?
Movies, politics, family.
Movies, politics, right? Where those are things where you can show a lot of enthusiasm and you don't need to give a really especially like movies. You don't need to be really careful. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. So you can have an enthusiastic opinion while having done no research on this question and not being able to define any of your terms. And so people are just finding it difficult to hit that intersection. And maybe it's particularly difficult to coordinate over that intersection with a group of people, right? Because I've been to and also been the recipient of enough Q&As to say a lot of Q&As are super interesting. Like they're genuinely engaged. There's genuine like investment. And there's also care. There's both of those things. And that's
highly structured, right? You might think it's highly structured.
It's highly structured, right? But what the high structure gets you then is like an ability for the group to coordinate around finding this intersection between the interesting and the careful.
So I've noticed that I've seen times when a speaker will just do Q&A with no prior talk. And that is a bit sloppier. So right. the combination of enthusiasm and precision is substantially lacking if you just start doing an ask me anything, say, right?
Yes, that's right. Because we have like, I run the undergrad program here in the philosophy department, and we have these events where you can ask me and I'm the director of undergraduate studies and the assistant director of undergraduate studies, you can ask us things like, what does it take to be a philosophy major? How do you get into grad school? Those sorts of questions. But we changed it to ask us anything. We changed it from, what is the major about, to ask us anything. And we get way more people showing up. They love the ask me anything format. It turns out. So that does generate a lot of enthusiasm, but it means the conversation just bounces all over the place. And we don't focus on, okay, let's go through all the requirements for the different flavors of the philosophy major, et cetera. So yeah, that's true. I mean, sometimes you have a text that was assigned in advance and people are I think that's the best of all combinations, is the text is assigned in advance. People read it in advance.
Right.
And then you have the Q&A. The problem is just what percentage of the audience have actually read it. As a speaker, you never really know. I try to ask and behind the scenes so people don't get offended, but because sometimes actually quite few of them have read it, and then you have to explain it a little bit.
So you've classified me as an autodidact in some ways.
I think you classified yourself that way.
Right.
Yes.
And so we could ask, what fraction of people without such a structure could just start talking to someone and, be both enthusiastic and careful. And so, I feel like I know how to do those things without a prep. I don't need an intro. If I just have a person I'm talking to, I know how, if they're saying something vague, to stop them and ask for precision or to try to find a more precise question. But it could be that takes a degree of confidence and experience that most people don't have or feel would go wrong too often. You might. So the story here, as you've been presenting it, is that we need these prepared contexts in which we can have a prepared style of interaction. And then some of those will be more focused on being careful, and some will be more focused on being enthusiastic. And we don't have very good prepared context to getting an intersection of those, although maybe a Q&A is the closest we have. But some people might be just able to, without a prepared context, with an appropriate other partner, just pick a topic they're most interested in and then start getting into it in a careful way.
I would predict autodidacts would be terrible at that. Because the whole thing of the autodidact is that they're not relying on, and therefore not learning how to rely on and make use of other people to learn stuff. And that's probably why they can get enthusiastic about ideas, irrespective of the social context, but they're probably also not actually going to be good at holding that kind of conversation. And if they're two autodidacts, that's not going to make it any better.
Maybe we need a third category, and then I'm not sure which category I'm in. One category is someone who just sits by themselves and thinks and comes up with things and just doesn't interact with other people very much at all. The opposite category might be people who grow up in very particular structured social contexts where they learn how to interact in that context they grew up in, prepared for them, say a university classroom lecture discussion or something. And then there could be a third group of people who pairwise meet each other and are just do that a lot, and then learn through practice to talk to each other usefully without having been trained in that in some shared structured context. They would just reinvent their interaction norms.
I guess I just feel like the gravitational pull of socializing between those two people would be so strong. It's sort of
not if they're nerdy.
Okay. But
if they're nerdy enough, they would then.
If they're nerdy enough, I think they'll just go separate ways. Honestly, that's the thing about the autodidactic nerds, is that nothing binds them together, and if stuff does bind them together, it pulls in the direction of socializing.
I'm telling you, there's a world I've seen different. I'm telling you, this is the world I've come from.
You mean there are worlds of intense conversations that go on where people seek out those people whenever they can.
There's worlds where people are able to productively talk about ideas both carefully and passionately, that they didn't inherit that world from some prepared world they all shared and were trained in, and they aren't just separate people thinking by themselves. There is such a world of these interacting nerds. that's the world I come from. So I know
Okay, I will just tell you that I know a lot of nerds who spend a lot of time by themselves. So
could be.
that's I'll just give you that as my data point. And so it may be that every once in a while, some of them find each other. I mean, as I said, I'm not skeptical that they can work together on a specific work topic.
So here's a basic fact about the world, which is, once upon a time, rare people were mostly loners. And as the world finds more and more way for rare people to find each other, they become more social. So this is a story about the internet and a story about many modern things, which is, in a small town, if you were the lone person who was an intellectual, you were mostly a loner. You were reading stuff by yourself and talking to yourself because hardly anybody else in the town had that sort of inclination. But if you, in a modern world, go to an intellectual town, like, I don't know, Boston or some place where there's a lot of concentration of intellectuals, then they suddenly become much more social as being around each other. And this is just a thing that's happened for many kinds of communities over the last century, is that unusual kinds of people who used to be relative loners found each other and then created communities where they were no longer loners. They were very social because they were around other people like themselves. And one of those things was tech in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley was the prototypical place where tech people came together and were much more social there once they found a lot of other tech people like themselves. That story is played out in many other topic areas too, where, again, people who were loners in the world they were in because they were very rare and couldn't meet other people like themselves became much more social when they found a way in a big city or a big online world to find other people like themselves. So people who were initially seen as intrinsically loners or asocial, in some sense, they were that because of their unusual features, making it hard to match with other people around them.
I'll just tell you that, like, this kind of myth of like the pure of heart intellectual nerd who just has this like passionate interest, and all they have to do is find the other people who are as pure of heart as them, and then they can like pursue their intellectual inquiry together, just strikes me as extremely false from my experience. And I know a lot of nerds, and I know a lot of nerds in academia. And like, I guess part of it is that I think the parameter, do you have social skills? And then the parameter, do you have intellectual interests, are pretty separate. So you could have high social skills and have really deep, passionate intellectual interests, and you could have low social skills and not have much of intellectual interest. These are just two separate things.
But these parameters aren't constants. They can change with time and context. That would be the key point. So like imagine someone who's, say, homosexual in a small town where maybe they only ever meet one other homosexual. Then they're going to keep that secret, say, and they're going to be these very secretive loner types who are bound together by this unusual thing. But if in a big city there's gay bars or something, then they can become very social and become a different sort of person. Because
sure, but they might also, that person might have just socialized with people on another issue if they were in the small town as well. They might not have been a loner. They might have been very friendly and socializing with other people who like certain kinds of books that they like, instead of socializing with people who are also gay.
But about the thing they were weird, they would be less social. They would be more social about the things that they had in common with people. So I think that is a very common feature.
Okay, fair enough. I guess I'm just saying that I know enough people who are intellectuals. They genuinely have intellectual interests, and they also have social skills, and yet they still don't, when they're together, like engage in intellectual activity unless they have some kind of framework for it. That for me is the norm of what I see in the world around me, and it's true of the nerds and the non-nerds. It's just true of everyone.
I'm telling you that I came from a different world.
Right. But we already discussed, right, the difference. Like, so one thing is maybe those people were amateurs and they were having, like, in some contexts, they were having technical discussions, right, where they had a specific topic that they had to do. And then in other contexts, they were kind of like having free flowing late night meaning of life, whatever types of what could the future be like conversations, where if you went back in time to those conversations, you might not find them very engaging.
But it might have been amateur, but it might not have been too. That is, that could just be a parameter that varies. So, in this world of people that I was involved with, again, from 1984 to 93, while I was in Silicon Valley, there were people there who, looking back, in fact, were the world's experts on some things.
Right.
And those conversations they were having passionately in those parties with each other were, in fact, the world's best conversations on the subjects. They weren't just amateurs. They were the best. Okay. But it was happening in that same sort of world of people who were socializing together, passionately talking to each other and being careful. All those things were happening together.
So all of those people today have computers. So you could be Zooming with them every day. How many of them do you talk to per day of these ideal conversationalists?
Well, so for myself, it was a world of a certain set of topics they were all interested in talking about together. And that when I was in that same world, interested in those same topics, I was talking with them a lot. But then I made this big switch to become an economist. I left Silicon Valley. I left the world of tech. And in 1993, started grad school at Caltech in social science. And so I moved to a different world. I still have some context there. But
I've yet to find the topic you're not interested in. So I'm skeptical of this analysis. What are the topics that you would be unwilling to discuss with them?
I mean, I was just at a social event a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to go to another one in a couple of weeks back in Silicon Valley with tech people. So I have a sense of the kinds of things they're interested in, the kinds of things they're not, and like where the border goes.
And you still go to these things. So all of these people,
right, but they have a limited set of topics. There's a limited degree of overlap with the topics they like and the topics I'm interested in. But enough that we have productive conversations.
Right. But I guess I mean, if this mecca exists, I would expect you to be reaping its rewards on a regular basis, on a daily basis, in fact, especially given how easy it is to do so. And yet you speak of this as though it were some time in your distant past in which you encountered the perfect intellectual environment that, gives you this rare thing of the interested and the careful.
But my story here is the idea that people with unusual interests, if they are randomly sorted among each other, they don't find other people to talk to very easily. But sometimes we can make a special, conglomeration of them where people come together around a set of topics that is similar enough, and then they can have a burst of this sort of social interaction, which is both passionate and careful when they are close enough in topics and enthusiasm and basically communication distance.
But the thing I'm telling you is that this is what is being really passionately interested in Aristotle's theory of perception and sense perception and his theory of how illusions and dreams work. That's pretty niche. It's a pretty unusual interest. And I was just with a group of people who are all really interested in that. And then there was a failure to discuss that. But what you could say, oh, they weren't the pure of heart, like the nerds who are really interested. But I think these people really are interested in this question. It's just that they're not able to talk about it.
I wouldn't say that they are not interested. I wouldn't say the nerds are pure of heart. I would just say, it's a simple sort of standard story. The nerds just are not less willing to play the social game because they're just not as good at it. And so they look better playing the nerdy discussion game than they do playing the social game because they just are bad at the social game. And so they do the other thing. I don't think they're more altruistic per se. I just think nerds, when we try to play the social game, everybody sees that we're not very good and we sort of move to the background and we're quiet and watch everybody else play because when we try to stick our hands in it and move, people go, yeah, you don't know what you're doing, back off.
So I'm surprised that nerds don't just develop social games that they're good at. In fact, this is true. They do this. So nerds play games, right?
Yes, board games.
Board games, card games, Dungeons and Dragons.
Right. So I think that's part of the great attraction of those things for nerds is that it's a kind of social game that they can play better.
Right. So maybe an interesting question would be if you had a bunch of these nerds, right? And then there were a game nearby that they could easily play where the shift into the playing of it would be almost no work.
Well,
would they continue the intellectual conversation or would they start playing the game?
I mean, My friend Brian Kaplan, as you know, has this every year gaming convention at his home. Yes. He calls KaplaCon. And at this gaming convention, intellectual conversations are common, as is game playing. And so people are, in fact, switching between the two. They're sitting around the kitchen table or in a hallway doing intellectual conversations, or they're going to play a game. And the people with those two preferences are mixing up there together. And you might think this works out well, because if it was only the intellectual conversations, then maybe they would, have conflicts, or maybe they would find it too threatening, or maybe they would, not be able to make it last, or sound stupid or whatever. But they've got these two options for activities. And now they can do the safe game thing, or when they feel in the mood or a conversation looks appealing, they can try to join into the conversation. And in some sense, that's a way. I mean, many other kind of parties are a mix of intellectual and social conversation. I've seen parties where in the same room there's 10 different conversations, and 3 of them are intellectual and 7 of them are social. And then people also have that option to play the social game or join one of the intellectual conversations. And it's sort of less threatening, because walking into the room doesn't commit you to join the intellectual ones. And if you don't like one, or it's not to your style, or you feel threatened by it, you can just slip over to one of the other ones.
I was once in a high table at an All Souls College in Oxford, and I was talking to the person next to me. And at a certain point, I don't know what happened. There was like the ringing of a glass or whatever. And then the thought was you were supposed to turn and talk. If you talk, whoever you're talking, you're supposed to start talking to the person on your left, and then you're supposed to turn to the person on your right. And I was in the middle of a conversation with the person on the left. And I was like, yeah, I'm not doing this. And they're like, no, you have to do it. You have to turn and now start talking to this other person. That's how it works. Right?
Yeah.
And I guess, like, to me, that you can have intellectual conversations even at these dinners or whatever, but they just don't tend to last very long. Like, there's some topic gets brought up, a little bit is talked about, and then you move on. And I mean, I'd be surprised if it were different at the gaming one. Like, yeah, there'll be some intellectual conversation. Right. People are kind of moving in and out, but there isn't something like a sustained inquiry, right?
So maybe that's the question we should be talking about here. Maybe what we should say is, ordinarily people are able to do intellectual conversations, and they do often do them, but they do them small little versions, go a little into the depth, and then they stop. And so we might more want to ask, well, what's different about the people who take a topic and go into much more depth for much longer? How are they distinguished from the other people? Yeah, or how do these environments like a Q&A allow that more sustained pursuit?
Yeah. So, and like, as you were gathering from me, I'm skeptical of the solution that says, well, there's the two kinds of people, the special ones who can do the sustained pursuit, and then the ordinary people. But yeah, I think the environment, having an environment. I mean, the thing about a Q&A is that, in a way, it isn't that sustained, right? Because it's different questions, and sometimes people will follow up, but you can actually move on to a different question.
So here's a version that actually works pretty well that I hadn't thought very much about. But okay, I've seen parties and social gatherings where someone holds court. You know what this means? There's some celebrity of some sorts in the group, and they are at the center of a group of attention, and they are pontificating on their favorite things. They may respond to questions and other people, but they are the center of attention, and they are getting the lion's share of the discussion. And if they pontificate on something intellectual, why then the group around them sustains that attention on an intellectual subject for a while, and even the larger rest of the room may be pulled in that direction as well. And that can be a lot like a speaker giving a talk.
Yes.
Right? In some sense, you might think it's the anchor on the person and their sustained orientation to an intellectual topic and their prestige in the group that can then sustain that for a larger group around them.
Yeah, good. I mean, that seems right, though, like, often that
sometimes you've even been known to hold court, right?
Yes, I certainly am. I'm like, when I can turn any dinner into a class, I will do so within the bounds of social acceptability. But I think so. So I think there's a reason why that works, there's a number of reasons, but one of the ones that strikes me is that part of what you need for an intellectual inquiry is you need someone to have their eye on what matters, right? Like,
right?
That there's something that's driving it. And so you're not just saying fun things that come into your head, but you're trying to go somewhere. Like, I'm trying to understand something about this. Is there really a deep tension between the social and the intellectual?
So the kind of people I'm imagining who hold court are also people known for having some theses that they push a lot. When they're holding court, they're often, arguing for their theses.
And that's what you do when you hold court. I actually am not sure that that's what I do.
But you and I know some people who are famous and who are center of attention, but they are not inclined to hold court. And I think they don't then create the same sort of sustained arena around them.
Right. I think that's right. So maybe you have to. Maybe you're right. Maybe it is a matter of having a thesis that you're arguing for. Maybe that is what I'm doing, actually, now that I think about it.
Certainly what a speaker does for a talk, and that sustains the Q&A.
Right. Sometimes it
could be a question too, like you might hold court with a question rather than a thesis, but it's still a focus, a concise focus.
I think pretty often a thing that I find myself doing is insisting that something is a paradox, where the rest of the people at the table are like, no, that's not a paradox. And I'm trying to make them be confused about it. Right. So it's not quite holding.
That's a thesis.
On a thesis, but it is sort of a thesis.
Axis of paradox is a thesis, yeah.
It's that I'm trying to induce confusion or to induce a certain kind of puzzlement, right? But the point
it creates
is just
sustained attention because you're sustaining attention to it and you aren't letting them turn away from it. And
that makes
you can go into depth.
It's so I feel like a big part of what I'm now thinking of is like a big part of the sort of difficulty here is that in a social situation, there's this problem of the coordination of attention, right? It's like, what are we all supposed to be paying attention to? Now, if I'm in charge of that and I can be like, everyone, here's what we're going to pay attention to. This is the question we're going to be looking into. That's basically just me teaching a class. And I'm very comfortable in that environment. But, usually at a dinner, like after a talk, even if I was the speaker, I'm not allowed to do that. And so there's this question, how will the attention of the group coordinate itself around a topic, and will it stick to one topic? And typically it won't. It will just waver between topics.
So it seems to me that when you're trying to get a group to stick to a topic, what people often do is they have to have a thesis, but the thesis can neither be too obviously right or too obviously wrong. A thesis that will grab the attention of a community will often be a thesis that has to be asserted by someone with status in the group, somebody who it's worth, say, disagreeing with, and who seems to be overstating their case. And I think people often do this on purpose. They exaggerate a claim to just the right degree so that they're tempting people to respond and rebut them. They are putting out some tempting meat for other people to go after, like you're trying to tempt an animal to come after some meat to come out of the woods or something. Basically, I think I see people, that's sort of a standard MO style of enticing a group of people to talk to something, is somebody prestigious throws out an apparently too strong of a claim, and then tries to defend it a bit. And then other people go, no, that can't be right. I'm going to take this guy down. I'm going to show him he's wrong, because they think they see a way to rebut this. And often the person who did this knowingly says something a little exaggerated that they can sort of pull back from a bit. But this is the way to get people to talk about it.
Yeah, that is like kind of an art form of being able to produce those slight exaggerations. Because the person who can do that can then direct the whole attention of a group. It's really a gift to be able to do that, right? Because even if you're like annoyed that the person is exaggerating, the alternative situation is one where the group breaks up into like 7 boring conversations about nothing, right? So that person has like done this great service to everyone by like getting everyone to coordinate around showing that they're wrong. in, this exaggerated claim, and then they might be, and I'm often that person of like
Right.
making the exaggerated claim, and then sometimes to my surprise, I'm like, actually, I believe this is
but you didn't when you started it.
or I was trying it out. I was like testing
Right.
it. I'm like, let me see if I can defend this, and then I can defend it better than I thought I
Right.
could, and I'm
Well, all
like,
it
yeah,
has
this
to
is
do
my
is-
view now.
It just has to seem weak, or it doesn't have to actually be weak, right? You have to have a claim that seems vulnerable. That like somebody could have an effective response.
Right. But you also have to have it like where they don't just feel bait and switch, right? Where you make a crazy claim and then it's like,
Right.
all I meant by it was this trivial claim. And then they're just like,
that's not going to work. Right. So you have to be able to sort of, if you do a retreat, you have to sort of cover the retreat well enough or make it less obvious that you did a retreat. Well, I think it's not just the claim. Often it's just the emotional tone with which you make a claim. So that this works in politics, often if you make some sort of indignant implication, right? The thing you said isn't actually very wrong, but you implied somebody else is just wrong, or, and that can also tempt people who feel like you're maybe implying something wrong about them or their group or something, and they come up to defend themselves.
One way we carved up the social versus intellectual earlier was interested versus careful, right? Where the idea is like in the social realm, we want to be interested, and in the intellectual realm, we want to be careful. Another way that I now am thinking about carving it up is sort of adversarial versus cooperative. That is, in an intellectual realm, we have kind of adversarial attitudes. We say that we're wrong. We say,
Right.
Here's why you're wrong. The basic interaction is, someone saying something and another person saying they're wrong, right? That's the basics, the building block of intellectual interactions. But in social interactions, people are supposed to be cooperative and nice, and here's another reason why you're right, or whatever. That seems a different way to carve it up.
That brings up this standard gender distinction of different academic professions. So like philosophy and physics and some other more tech areas are known for having more direct confrontation, whereas some other areas like sociology are known that like somebody gives a talk and everybody says nice things, and then they go out in the hallway and they trash it to each other privately, but they won't challenge it in the talk. Whereas in, say, physics or philosophy or some other, or econ, it's actually expected to challenge. If you're too nice in your Q&A, that just seems like you're shilling for them or something, right? So you're almost supposed to come up with something a bit hostile or a bit challenging to say. And as I think we've discussed that, there's a stereotype that women, when they're trying to, socialize, they're trying to connect and find a common connection, whereas men are trying to have a little fight. They're trying to do a little combat and see who comes out looking better, and that correlates with these, different styles of these different intellectual areas. So, I mean, presumably everybody has both, but this, when professional combat, social, so cooperative, that doesn't actually map onto many other disciplines where the professional thing is also very cooperative, at least, in front of each other.
Right. At least in front of each other. I mean, I think, women can be very adversarial, like about one another.
Yeah, but not just directly to each other.
A lot of academic confrontations are not face to face, right? They're going to be in writing, they're going to be responding. And so there's going to be plenty of opportunity for third personal critique. I
think you're right, though. I think just everybody is keeping track of the parameter with respect to everybody they interact with. Is like, how often were they having a confrontational versus cooperative relationship with me, right? You can tolerate, a 20% of confrontational time as long as the other 80% is cooperative. And so I think maybe academics for whom their professional interactions are confrontational, then they just need this other socializing time where they fill up the other percentage, where they can, decide that we're colleagues and like each other, because overall we just had enough cooperative time.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I wonder if it would be interesting to study different academic disciplines and to see whether in the dinners after the talk, there's more of that intellectual activity when it's like whatever, sociology or something, and by contrast with, say, philosophy or economics, which are more adversarial. Is it that we need to have some bonding time or something? I guess I also just think, though, that like even it's true. So I was putting out this other way of carving it up, which is the adversarial versus cooperative. But I think that it's also just true that, inquiring with someone requires a fair amount of sort of getting on the same page with them. Like, even if you're pushing them and you're trying to show that they're wrong.
So I remember this anecdote about sort of when US military people would go to the Middle East and try to train military people in the Middle East. Apparently, one thing they found is that if people they were training had more than one level in terms of their rank, it wouldn't work because the lower rank people would never do anything to make it appear that upper rank people were less than always perfect. They just couldn't tolerate that. And so you'd always have to just train people all at the same rank, because otherwise, they would just never an upper rank person would just never tolerate any situation where a lower rank person somehow knew an answer that they didn't or was better at something. They just couldn't tolerate that. And so that's, a more extreme example of how, certain sort of social things won't tolerate being honest in certain ways. So you might think that, look, arguing and inquiring will require that even if our ranks are different, at some point, my rank is higher, but I'm going to admit you were right and I was wrong, or things like that. And that's going to require a fair bit of trust and comfort with each other to be able to do that.
Right. And that's where it sort of seems like these things start to become interconnected in ways, as opposed to pulling in opposite directions. So that's confusing, that we're ending in aporia. That's the term in the Socratic dialogues for when people are at a loss or don't know their way out or whatever, because I feel like we've just come around in a circle. But I'm going to we're over time already. I'm going to give you the last word.
I will just say this was fun.
Okay. All right.
All right. Take care.
Bye.